from before freshman year until their seniors, getting them through this project. And really do appreciate everybody chipping in and doing their part and giving of your time and energies to help improve what they're doing. And this is something you should listen to, guys, is that, every bit of criticism or commentary or suggestion you get is solely aimed to make your final product in your senior thesis better. All right? Some students at this stage take the comments a little bit too personally. They're not meant to be personal slams. They're just professional critiques, professional criticisms. Take them that way. Use them to make your end product the best it can be. This is one of several points where we check in over a 4-year period of time to make sure when they finish this thing up as graduating seniors that it's a really nice product. All right, so that's your job. All right, so let's just introduce everyone around the table, if we could, please.
Sure, I'm Peter Henning. I'm at START, the Terrorism Research Center. I research there, running a project on domestic radicalization in America for one more day. So if you need me after that, I told you guys that, right? Yeah. So
One more day.
Are you leaving?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah, I'm leaving. Yeah, not getting fired.
Yeah,
I'm going.
you said leaving of your own accord, or?
Yes, yeah, I'm going to the Pew Research Center, so I'll still be in the area.
So you're in the neighborhood. We have a former colleague here who's working at Pew now. So. Great.
And I'm Judy Markowitz, I'm reference librarian, just helping you with your lit review and helping you find sources if you can't, strategies and things like that.
I'm Richard Yim. I'm a former psychology and I'm the team mentor.
I'm Kristen Skindal. I'm the Associate Director of the Gemstone program.
And that's yours.
All right. Well, I'm Natalie Griffin,
I'm Christian John.
I'm Chris Capro.
I'm Rahul Srinivas.
and we're representing Team Judgment. Basically, we're studying one of the aspects of psychology of violent extremism, and particularly we're looking at the frame of mind in which extremists make decisions. So, violent extremism is
There you go. Perfect.
it's a growing problem and worldwide. It's been steadily increasing, as you can see, from 2004. It's most prevalent in South Asia and the Middle East, but that doesn't mean it's not a problem to U.S. interests or in the United States. In 2012, there were over 8,000 incidents in 85 different countries. 13 of those were in the United States. So in the U.S., we classify attacks mostly under group terrorism or lone wolf. Group terrorism would be things like 9/11 coming from groups like Al-Qaeda. Lone wolf would be attacks perpetrated by one or just a couple individuals who take on an ideology basically on their own with some outside influence. Examples of that would be like the Boston bombings, the Fort Hood shootings. And also in the United States, we classify 4 different types of violent extremism. So that would be left-wing, things like black nationalist groups, right-wing, things like white supremacy groups, individual action groups, which are things like environmental extremist groups, and then also religious groups. Particularly right-wing is a problem in the United States. From 1990 to 2010, there were 348 people killed by right-wing violent homicides, and that was because of 145 separate incidents. That includes the Oklahoma City bombings. One of the goals of psychological research is to have eventually rehabilitation and de-radicalization programs. Some countries like Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Pakistan already have implemented these types of programs, but many of them are religious-based, and obviously that's not an option in America. So right now there's not quite the amount of psychological research that supports this, but that's what we're working towards. So there is no root cause for terrorism or biological cause that makes a terrorist. However, there are several behavioral theories that explain how people get involved with violent extremism, and we're going to look at 5 in particular. The first is social learning theory. This basically means that we learn in an environmental context. We learn from those with whom we surround ourselves with. So if a child grows up in a violent environment, grows up with violent role models, they're more likely to become violent. The next is identity theory. This is when a person derives who he or she is based on a group membership or an idea. Particularly youths are vulnerable to this. especially right now via the internet, a lot of their information is coming from these sources. One main problem that that the United States has been looking at is from a group called Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. They recruit heavily online, and they do it through something called Inspire magazine, which is a radical Islamic magazine translated into English. The next is regulatory fit theory. This basically means that if an individual thinks they fit into a school of thought or into a group, that perpetuates their own beliefs. They become more justified in those beliefs. So for extreme thinkers, if they find others that agree with their beliefs, they're more likely to promote those violent actions. Rational choice theory, this basically means that people make rational decisions. People are able to weigh the good and the bad and come up with a rational decision. This can still apply to terrorists, even though their decisions might not seem rational. They see it as a way to rationally bring about change. However, there is a deviation from that, and that's called splitting. When people split, they don't see the good or the bad in their decisions. This has been put with borderline personality disorder, and these people are prone to extreme actions and extreme thinking.
Thank you, Natalie. So we're going to step away from the terrorism side of our project, and we're going to move along to the psychology side. So what we're planning on doing is using a theory called control level theory, which is a social psychological theory that shows the relation between psychological distance and the extent to which people's thinking resembles either abstract or concrete thought. So going along that line, one of the things that we talk about is concrete thought or low level. So low level or concrete thought is more when you think complexly or more in the present tense, versus abstract thought, which what we define as simple thought or more future thinking, and that's high level. So moving on to the next slide, we have an example. So if you were to look at this picture and think about it and look at it and describe it to me, someone in high level thought would say that the father and son are having fun, or it's a father and son bonding experience. So those people are looking at it from a more simple aspect, more abstract point of view, versus someone in low level. So if you were thinking about this in low level, they'd present more details, such as the father and son are both wearing red shirts, or the color of the son's shoes are white, things of that nature. Going on, we're going to do one more example. So control is broken up into long-term and short-term, like I mentioned earlier. High-level control and low-level control. So if I were to ask you a question, in high-level control, what are you doing a year from now? Versus if I asked you a low-level, which is what are you doing today? The answers that you would give me are different in that if I were to ask you something a year from now, the chances are that your response would be more of a simple, general answer, or it'd be broader. Versus if I asked you something, what are you doing today? It's more concrete, and you can see the present moment. So you give me an answer that's a little bit more complex or descriptive. So moving on to this is just a small outline of what I mentioned. So what we're going to be looking at is how and why control. How is more of a low-level control that deals with getting someone's attention in the here and present sense, versus the why, which is looking at more future tense. And for the high level, it exhibits long-term impact versus a low level, which shows immediate benefits or immediate consequences. So the application of our project of control. So it's seen that people that are in high level control tend to be less impulsive, and people in low level control tend to be more impulsive. We're deviating a little bit from that sense, and we're going to talk about how our project is saying the complete opposite. So in our project, we're saying that abstract thinking leads to more future thinking, or makes the concept of violent extremism more abstract or not as real to you at the present moment if you're thinking about it in the future. So we're going to say that results in more likelihood to engage in violent extremism, which is away from the norm of what it usually says. It usually says that high-level people are thinking more about the future, which means that they're going to be less impulsive to do something like this in the future. Now, on the low-level side, we're going to talk about how ideas are abstract concept. So thinking about that low level, we're going to say that people are more likely to think about the present moment, and think about the idea as something that's gonna happen now. So that's gonna lead to less likelihood to engage in violent extremism based on the fact that they're thinking more about their immediate consequences and their immediate logistics of said action. And then the next slide. This is actually a proven control manipulation that's used in psychological labs currently. So this manipulation, if you look on the left side, shows the Y control, which is the high level control. So we're going to show you a vignette later on, a sample vignette later on in our presentation. But feeding the hungry comes from that vignette. Now, feeding the hungry, if I would ask you why would you feed the hungry, you would give me an answer in the next box below. And then I would ask you why again to the response that you gave me, and then you'd answer that again and again. And this is in literature said to make people think more abstractly or think more about the future tense, versus the right side, which is the how control. So on this side, we start from the bottom to make it, and then we rise up to make it more like present moment. So feeding the hungry, how would you feed the hungry, versus, and then another how question to what you said in the box previously. So this is a proven manipulation that we've looked at, but we're going to deviate a little bit away from this manipulation itself, and we're going to go with a vignette control combination that Rahul will talk about later in the method section. Now, that leads us to our research question, and our research question says, how does a control manipulation affect an individual's likelihood to engage in violent extremism? And with that,
Thank you. So to test our research question, we've developed a 4-part methodology. First, we have our survey, which will basically be a basic demographic survey. We actually have an example of that. So this might be a mock-up of one of those surveys. It'll ask the participants their age, GPA, ethnicity, maybe the languages spoken, place of origin, political party, things of that nature. This is not an all-inclusive survey, and it's definitely subject to change based on lit review and our own findings. So next we have, as Christian was talking about, our vignette. And for our purposes, we're trying to create our own vignette and merge it with our construal. So we have a mock-up of a sample vignette, and it's basically telling you about Amy, or a leaf worker who works to feed the hungry. And the parts in brackets are things we can change. We can change the name Amy, we can change what she does, we can change it so that it's George and it's a he. And as Christian was talking about, we're actually going to try to merge the vignette into the construal. And this is a new way of approaching this through our own lit review. We hadn't found of anyone that's tried to do this before, so we're actually going to pilot test it. And if it turns out that we're not getting the best results through a pilot test, we will go back to the control manipulation Christian showed you with the Y on the top and the how on the bottom. But we have created a mock-up of what our vignette control might look like. And it's basically a brief paragraph. Again, it's Amy, and if we're doing a Y control, a high-level control, we'd ask something like, why is Amy feeding the hungry? And we'd ask the participant to note down their response, and then they'd be given another paragraph, and then after that they'd be given another why question. And on the other hand, if it's a how question, it'd be the same paragraph, just how is Amy going to feed the hungry? So after the vignette and construal is given, the participant will be instructed to fulfill a brief questionnaire. And the scale we're going to use for this questionnaire is a visual analog scale, and it'll look a little something like this. We'll ask them questions such as, how do you feel about the following ways in which Amy could respond? And we'll give them 2 or 3 options. For example, form a civilian militia, abide by the government's wishes, or halt the delivery of all aid. And they'll be able to take this little slider and take it wherever they want to go, with 0 being no concern and 100 being extreme concern. Now here's Chris to explain our hypothesis.
Thank you. So, since we're looking at violent acts that aim to make ideological impacts in society, people that engage in these acts, they're looking to the future. They're looking to make impacts to society in the future. So, since ideas are an abstract thought, we're predicting that the high-level construal, when implemented to a participant, they will be more prone to either side or, in extreme cases, actually participate in violent extremism. And on the contrary, we're also predicting that when given low-level construal, they will be more likely to stray towards the non-violent side. So to do all this, we need money. We plan to go to a conference in Boston, hopefully. We also need money to travel there. We need various tools such as laptops and programs like SPSS to do our analysis, as well as Microsoft Office to draft all the documents that we create, as well as the office supplies needed to hand out all these documents to our participants. Also, since we're doing a process that we have to pilot test and we're not exactly sure how it's going to turn out, we have to account for the possibility that our findings are either inconclusive or not significant enough for published journals to accept our research. So we're accounting for $1,000 for open access journal, which will allow us to publish, so to speak, on our own, our findings, even if they're not significant enough for an actual journal to accept. So looking into the future, we're on our way to IRB approval, drafting all the documents in order to apply for that, as well as creating our pilot testing vignette and questionnaire. Once we're IRB approved, hopefully, we will begin collecting data in the fall of 2014, as well as preparing for various presentations such as Junior Colloquia, Undergrad Research Day. Once we finish collecting our data, we will begin our statistical analysis in the fall of 2015, as well as beginning our finalizing our lit review and beginning our thesis drafts. And then finally, in the spring of 2016, we'll finalize our thesis and present our results at the thesis conference. Any questions?
All right, nice presentation. We typically start out, let our visiting experts start off with the question, but I'm going to preempt that with one single question, then I'll hand it over to you. Reading your thesis, there's no authors on it. Who wrote this thing? No names on it. All right, just little details like that are very important. I want to know who's claiming this work. So make sure your full team authorship gets front and center on page one. All right, sorry, this detail. Go right ahead.
Okay. So just a disclaimer, I'm not a psychologist, so apologies if, not being a psychologist, I don't know. So I'm coming at this as a political scientist who's interested in terrorism and extremism and kind of how we would react to the project and the findings. To start off, I thought it's an excellent project and it's really impressive, both as undergraduates and even if you were graduates, to be doing this sort of work. I thought it was really well written. I'd never heard of construal theory before, so I was able to get the basic gist of it from your writing, which is a useful skill to have. As an academic, I wish I could do that as well. Although I know I'm not supposed to here just to compliment, but I want to give you a compliment. And now move on. So the one is
Help balance this out.
yeah. Is the most annoying question I ever get is so what? But I'm going to ask that. So that's the big thing to be clear about the front is what is the originality and novelty of your approach in this project? And I think there is one, obviously, but you want to tell me that, right? So you kind of discuss it in the conclusions a bit, which is useful, but kind of put in the introduction and make clear that just using a new method isn't enough, I think, to be dramatic, right? You want to say will you find new results about the nature of extremism that existing studies can't get to, either sociological, political science, or psychological? Or is the benefit for a psychologist, you're showing look, this construal method, this theory applies to this different area that no one's really looked at before. And so that's just something to put up, right up front. I think it's feel free to be a little bold and kind of say why this will change the world, so to speak. And the thing about your audience, eventually, are you writing it for people like me who like terrorism and know nothing about psychology, or for psychologists, right? So what level of detail do you focus on the psychological debates or the broader kind of extremism, political violence debates? Those kind of things to think about, I suggest. The next part is the theoretical issues. So one is just, again, a really annoying thing you always run into is external validity. And I think it's something you run into often when you're using kind of psychology or psychological methods to deal with kind of these macro-social phenomena like terrorism, right? And you do talk about it, I'm pretty sure the conclusions, you did talk about it a bit, but again, I think more about it and go into detail about the strengths and weaknesses, right? What can you say about things beyond the specific mechanism of willingness to engage in violence and construal, and what can you say? And just be transparent. So think through that. And it's probably good primers on how to discuss external validity in your field. For the theory, 4 quick points, and I've written this up so there's more detail there with some suggested citations. Basically, it seems sound, right, your theoretical approach, that abstracting out makes you more likely to engage in violence. It makes sense to me, right? Is that basically it? The thing is that not everyone thinks that, and you didn't really go into this in the discussion, and I think it's worth kind of bringing it up, because if someone who disagrees with you is reading this or listening to you, they're like, well, I don't think that. So 4 alternative explanations just to highlight. One is that people don't think extremism is always an issue of beliefs. It's kind of a bunch of guys phenomenon where people interact and they just decide to start blowing stuff up, not really buying into the cause, right? They join groups because they want to feel like, that they have friends, things like that. So that's kind of an alternative mechanism. And I've got sources in here. Another is the idea that, it involves a psychological process and beliefs, but it's not necessarily intensifying, abstracting on the future. It's just the need to feel important. I mean, Kruglenski is here, and I'm pretty sure you know him. Like the quest for significance type explanation might be seen as an alternative to yours. So I included a little link to a report Stark did discussing this, but you can probably find some others. Again, and it's in the written comments. Generally, with rational choice, you mentioned it kind of fits with yours, and I think that makes sense. But sometimes rational choice is used to critique the idea that ideas matter, especially in political science. I don't know elsewhere. The idea that, this isn't about ideas, this is about what's the best way to advance your interests. So that's just a third thing to think about and phrase it. The fourth is mine is more directly related to your theory, and this might just be my own thing, but you mentioned like people often think that abstracting out leads you away from violence, right? Which would seem to be my impression, and I didn't get kind of that sense that that's the common knowledge in the report, which may have kind of missed it. But I talked because that was my first thought. Well, wouldn't thinking clearly about the consequences make you not engage in violence? And if that is what people often think, and you're disagreeing with it, that's another place where you can really highlight how important your project is. So that's just kind of clarifications a bit. In terms of practical stuff, I think the timeline looks okay. I'm working on one of these multi-year projects right now, and you've left a lot of time for data collection, which is good. Just be prepared for lots of delays. And maybe that's like in there, you don't want to say delays. So that makes sense. For the questionnaire, and again, the psychologists in the room might have better things to say on this, but I think you're going to run into the social desirability bias issue, which we talked about before. I don't know how to get around it, but just there's that. One thing to think about is whether the willingness to engage in violence, which seems to be what you'd be measuring in the questionnaire, is necessarily the same as extremist violence. So you mentioned like domestic abuse and video games as examples. That's one mechanism leading to violence, but is it the same as extremism? And again, there might be psychological studies to back up that they are, but I think that's clear. But you want to think about a potential way to do this is to have some question about, some civil rights issue, like Martin Luther King, his things that everyone is pretty much on board with. They think this was a good thing, and then ask would you be justified using violence in support of a just cause, etc. There might be better questions from the literature, but maybe adding that to the questionnaire alongside domestic violence type questions could help you link the two. Finally, just about hypotheses. I didn't see them in the presentation, but you mentioned them. But I just have very clear hypotheses, both yours and alternative hypotheses. Like, if you follow a different theory, this is what we expect to find. Just to clarify some of that. And again, there's a little bit more in here, some nuts and bolts stuff, so I can give that to you afterwards.
Well, that's a good series of thoughts to address, and we're not going to let you off the hook by letting you just say, "Oh, good, thanks." Some reaction to some of those. We could break them down step by step if we want. Is there some immediate thought, reaction to that? How you might take that and run with it, or use it to improve your product?
A lot of the stuff that Dr. Henney mentioned is something that we need to expand in our literature review. And the methods part, social desirability bias is something that we talked about, and something we're still trying to figure out how to get around, because it is a tough thing, because many people aren't going to come in and be like, yes, I'm gonna 100% engage in violence. So that's something that we're working on doing more lit review on. So a lot of stuff right now I feel like is enhancing our literature review, adding things such as how we're going to get around social desirability bias. We're also going to expand our construal level theory lit review to make it a little bit more, dynamic and more intact. So.
Maybe one of the other things, and I didn't quite understand from what you said, was an alternative hypothesis. What would something like that look like?
So again, this might not be psychological, like this might not be the standards used, but usually in my work, you have, the main hypothesis, X leads to Y.
Mm-hmm.
The alternative hypothesis would be X does not lead to Y, or Z leads to Y, etc. So in your report, the main hypothesis would be people with high-level construal prompting are more likely to accept extremist violence, right?
Mm-hmm.
The alternative hypothesis would be there's no effect, or that the low-level construal leads to extremist violence. The rule of thumb I've always gotten from my advisors was like, do every alternative explanation better than they do it. So think through every critique you might get, how would they actually operationalize it, even if they don't do it well in their papers? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So I thought what you were talking about with the violence versus extremist violence was very interesting, and we actually did think about that very early on. We've kind of drifted away. I had something else to say, but yeah, I did think that was interesting, and we're definitely going to do more lit review. And I think one way that we could maybe deal with that situation is maybe in our questionnaire asking them something about how they would feel if one of their ideological beliefs was violated. And maybe that'll give you a better sense of violence versus ideologically based violence.
And on that same track, different individuals have a different perception of what is violence, what is not violence. Some acts that some people consider very violent and very offensive, other people consider as standard.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know how you do it either, but how do you kind of gauge the respondent as to where their threshold for what is violent or what is extreme? Kind of you have to categorize that, it seems like somehow up front, so you can kind of normalize your responses.
So one of the things, I'm not sure if we mentioned in our presentation, is that we're doing a within subject model. So we are going to test them on either high or low level construal, and then also no construal a week later, and that would be randomized. The no construal could be first, and then the low construal could be second. So still, yeah. So one of the ways we're gonna hopefully try to address that is base that change off of their original response with no construal. But of course, that's something that we're looking at and looking if that's a good measure.
So you go to some steps to create a baseline per individual.
Right.
Exactly.
Great, yeah, that's what I was kind of getting at. Perfect. Other points that your expert brought up that you would like to address at this time?
The external validity thing, I don't think we mentioned it in our presentation, but our participants are going to be gained through SONA, and that's a psychology-based credit system here on campus. And we're mostly going to take people from Psych 100 and Psych majors, but I do think that there's significant variation in those people because construal is more like a mental thing, it's not a physical thing. So I think even if we have a relatively uniform-looking demographic, I think each and every individual will be different in the way they respond to the construal. And I think we are doing a random assignment of construal versus no construal, high and low construal. So I think that should bolster our external validity.
I guess to clarify, I guess I was using externality in a loose sense, in the sense of almost an aggregation issue, right? So you're measuring a psychological mechanism that might occur with terrorists, moving from there up to actual engaging in violence.
Okay.
Just to think about.
Yeah, so I think the way you should think about this research is that the external validity as applies more broadly to application is probably pretty low. It's a limitation, but that's always the case with kind of laboratory-based experimental research. What we're trying to do is kind of isolate the mechanism, and it's almost like what would be considered a proof of concept research, right? Does the idea have merit? And then if it does, once you guys have established the merit of the idea, then you can see whether it is applicable in a population where it does actually, violent extremism actually manifests itself. Right now, you're just trying to, when we do clinical research, very frequently we'll do something with non-clinical populations first. Does the idea have merit? Does it work? And if it works, then you go and apply it to the target population, right? The original study does not actually have very low external validity. idea is that it has high internal validity, and that's what you guys should be probably clearly stating off the bat.
And I would say building off of that, your proposal is a significant improvement from your methodology section. So know that I think you've done a really good job in working on what should be in that section. But I do think you need to add some more information on validity and reliability. And once you've developed your survey and questionnaire, you'll have a better sense of what your variables actually are. Because I think the statistics you've outlined right now aren't actually measuring what you think they're measuring. So for example, the Cronbeck alpha is a measure of reliability, not a measure of validity. So just going through and thinking about, and I have notes for you on that. What are you trying to measure and how will you measure it? And some of that is you just don't know yet, and that's okay. But you'll want to think about that before you run the analyses. And certainly your mentor is a wonderful resource for that. So thinking about your variables will help define what test you'll use.
Okay. Judy has some.
No, let me pass and you go and I'll say something.
Okay, so I actually appreciate a lot of the previous comments because I think let me try if I can kind of tie some of those points in. I think in a way that's probably one of my biggest questions. And so the comments regarding what's the alternative outcome and your explanation of the alternative outcome, the contrasting violence versus this kind of what you guys are studying, which is a bit more of a strategic violence. We've also talked about kind of the worker bee versus the queen bee, right? The planning versus the executing. What you guys are doing is taking a construal level theory and going pretty much inconsistent with the established literature on how CLT affects behavior, right? And I actually think that that's a super cool thing, and I like the idea. What is the scenario under which you might actually get results that are consistent with the literature? So if you think about it, what's the scenario in which a low-level construal might actually promote violence, and a high-level construal would be less likely to promote violence, and that would be more consistent with the established literature on CLT. That's an alternative outcome. What's a scenario under which that could happen, right? And how are you, in your study, measuring, manipulating the variables that allow you to kind of decipher, right? Because if there is a certain scenario under which that could happen, right? And then you're treating the study as all one thing and saying, high-level control will make people more violent, but then within your study you have a bunch of people who did the exact opposite, right? Which would be a very interesting finding in itself. What you would end up getting is no effect, right? No difference, but it's not because there's no difference, it's because some people influence them in one direction, some people influence them in the other direction, right? Perhaps the planners, your hypothesis was correct, right? Because it's consistent with the way you're thinking about it, right? But if I think about the person who straps a bomb to themselves and blow themselves up because they promised money to feed their family, to me that person is not a high-level control thinker, right? That person is thinking very, very low-level control, and that's what's more likely to create that violence. So I'm wondering how you guys are planning on kind of addressing that issue.
So basically, kind of just what you said, I think that needs to be laid out in our paper that we are targeting a specific aspect of this population and trying to apply our research to that, because we aren't doing the so-called worker bees, the people who, are influenced by ransom, kidnapping, whatever. We're doing the planners, we're doing the people who are self-motivated. So I think, that needs to be addressed in our paper, and we probably need some more literature on that in our review to just kind of flesh that out and make it clear.
I also think that when you were talking about scenarios where the low-level control would come in more effective than the high-level control, I think it's a scenario that should be mentioned in the paper. But with that being said, I feel like the low-level control, our hypothesis says that the high-level control will lead to more impulsivity in this area. So I feel like one of the things that we talked about was splitting. So one of the things that we talked about was people's likelihood to be on an extreme side. I honestly think that's going to really affect whether the high-level control or the low-level control is going to affect them more. And I feel like that's something that we should also add to the paper based on that.
I think one of the problems is we're very focused on the ideological basis of terrorism, and so all our research is being put into that, if people subscribe to this ideology and they subscribe to it wholeheartedly, I think high-level control would influence them to engage in ideologically based violence. But as you said, if someone's being threatened, if someone's needs money, and the only way to do that is terrorism, I think that a lot of that has to do with rational choice theory. And if that's their best option, if that's the only way they can feed their family, then they're probably going to do that. So maybe we should flesh that out in the research paper as well.
Can I build off of that?
Yeah,
Little
go right
trivia question? So how did you explore, assess, and integrate scholarly literature into your proposal?
What do you mean?
I don't understand the question.
How did you find sources, and how did you decide if they were good sources or not? And how did you determine what to include and what not to include in the proposal?
Okay, so, well, we kind of started on our own, just looking at resources like JSTOR, the library resources. Then we met with our librarians, who were very helpful in pointing us in the direction of several research databases and different psychological journals. So basically, the majority of our sources come from academic journals that are peer-reviewed. Was our basis for whether or not they were reliable. Some of them aren't, because some of them are statistic-based. A lot of our information regarding the extremist thinking comes from START, which is on campus, which has pretty much proven themselves they're a reliable source. And Christian actually has some experience with controllable theory, so he was able to help us with that literature.
Yeah, so leading off of that, so I actually work in Dr. Yu's lab, but one of the projects that we do is with controllable theory, and one of his graduate RAs helped point me in the direction of some literature like Trope, Lieberman, and Fujiwara, and then those are like the three main people in the field of control level theory. The literature is extremely dense, so it is really hard to just sit there and read through the whole thing, which is kind of a problem. But the main thing that we did to sort our literature and things like that were, one, we based it off of how reliable the authors were in general, and then after that we would sort it out, and then if we saw something that wasn't as relevant to our project as it should be, like one of the articles I found about Cronbach's alpha was just showing how to administer Cronbach's alpha, but it wasn't like the most scholarly article, so we fleshed that out. So a lot of our resources were based on looking up something, bringing it to the group, looking at it, oh, it's not as relevant as we thought, tossing it out and things of that nature.
And then when we went to edit, we certain members of our group went through, checked the sources, made sure they were talking about what we said they were talking about, and making sure that lined up with our paper.
There was just one, I guess, a comment on the strength of your case that you're making is the flavor. I have no background in this literature, so I'm getting totally cold when I read through it. I didn't walk away from it with the feeling that you're presenting established theory and say, we're going to turn it upside down and go the opposite direction. It's probably just a matter of the words you chose and how strongly you stated that. It may be crystal clear there, but I didn't walk away with that feeling. So just go back and reread that and see if you need to restructure it a little bit to give the reader the sense who doesn't have any background in this area to be able to walk away and say, yes, this is the theory that's accepted, and we're turning it on its head and looking at it from the opposite direction. I didn't get that until today, which is great that you brought that forward, but reading it, I didn't come home with that.
Can I just make one comment when you were asked about your literature review? Do you remember what we said to you about JSTOR? Because I know that.
Yes.
What was it?
That it doesn't incorporate all the necessary years that we need to incorporate.
There's a 5-year delay.
Right, there's a 5-year delay. And so JSTOR was something we had looked at prior to our meeting, and then after that, we still used it, but we turned to
It's
some
a good
of
source
the-
to use. You
Right.
just have to remember it to supplement with others.
Right.
And then following citations, you did that too, right? If you found an article that was perfect for what you wanted to use it for, you would then take the citations and follow up on those.
Absolutely. Just last week, I found an article about how to create a vignette, and they actually cited another article, and I went into that other article, and the other article actually proved to be more useful.
Okay, good. And And one last comment, I was very interested in the way you described actual journal versus open access journal. And there is a difference, of course, but there are some very respected open access journals out there where people have to submit their articles and to the editors and they're vetted and things like that. So.
Open access journals are still journals.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and they're still reputable, and they're still, most of them, or many of them are still peer reviewed the way other journals are.
And that's what we're trying to move towards, open access.
Okay. Other questions before I hit one last one I want to talk about? All right. If not, sometime between last week and today, your budget doubled.
Yeah, I was actually.
Want to explain that to me?
Okay, so our
Let's pull that budget back up.
I mean, we reviewed it, and what was it? We realized that our
STR conference.
yeah, our conference was not accurate.
Yeah, so we assumed that travels, Boston travels, hotel and everything would cost us about $1,000 versus what it actually would cost us, which is closer to about $3,000, especially if we take in our entire team. So we changed our budget from something that was more like practical to something that we decided was more ideal. So what we want as a project versus like what we will get. So another thing we changed is the laptops. We said initially that we were going to get Chromebooks because they were cheap, and but after discussion we decided to get more technically advanced laptops, like things that can run like harder software, so that we could so we don't have to allot for the computer like failing or something or breaking. And then we're also going to have one backup laptop just in case that happens.
Okay.
The other thing that was added was the open access journal costs, which we just discussed since our project is kind of risky with the results that that might be something that we need to look into.
Okay. I can comment briefly on all those areas. Okay, start from the top. This is a promise I make to all senior teams. Okay, if your research leads to a journal publication, we will find funds to cover publication charges. Okay, that's a gift to you if you get that quality work done, because we want the publications out there, right? All right, so I'm glad you're budgeting for it. $1,000 is maybe too low, but okay. Conferences. This is just tucking you back your memory for future use, because I expect you guys to do it a lot cheaper. As a professional going to a national or international conference, standard rule of budgeting is $1,000 plus $200 a day. So if you go for 3 days, $1,600 to get one person to a conference. Okay, so but students will quadruple up in a room. You will eat McDonald's every meal, and
For 5-star.
right. So you will do it cheaper, and you will pack yourselves into a Toyota and drive. Okay, so the conference again. If you submit an abstract to a professional meeting, and it's a full-blown professional conference, and you're accepted to present either a presentation orally or a poster, we will go as far as we can to make sure we get at least some subset of your team there. This year we're already sending 3 teams on trips. Last year we sent teams to San Diego, Las Vegas, Orlando.
Myrtle Beach.
Myrtle Beach.
Myrtle Beach.
Yes.
Yeah, Myrtle Beach,
That was this
right?
fall, I think.
Yeah, so we do like that happen, and of course, when you were there, you were waving the Gemstone flag very, very aggressively.
I think we need to go on some of those trips to those warmer places. Where it's difficult.
Okay, those are almost, I'm not worried about your materials expenses category. 3 new laptops and software that is basically available from OIT. Why do you need 3 new laptops to do that?
So basically one of the problems, we don't want, all of us are going to be running participants, so we don't want it to be, okay, this information's on someone's laptop and this information's on someone else's laptop, so we want one laptop for participants and it's not going to be used for other things. That being said, our hope is to run multiple participants at the same time, therefore we'd be needing 2 laptops. And the third would be an ideal situation where we'd have a third in case of a failure, in case there's 3 participants there. that's all.
Okay. I think I remember you saying like 210 participants, something like that you were aiming to run total. So, okay, so you're doing one or two at a time, that's a lot of time. Okay, just for you to know, if you purchase a material like a laptop on our budget, when you're done with it, it goes in my closet. Okay, it comes back here, we have it, and we recycle it for other use. So it's something that you use strictly on the project, and then stays in the project. So, I don't know if that influences your thinking or not, but that's the way it works. Alright, so, and a lot of the software you can get, if you do have a machine, you can get the software, the university license. It shouldn't cost you much. And we can give you all the paper you want.
I have one more question that I forgot.
Go ahead.
Your sample demographic survey, why did you choose to let individuals self-identify rather than give them options from which to choose?
Self-identify which aspect?
So if you go back to the,
Open-ended.
so I
Questions.
can give you any religion
Mhm.
in the world on that list. I can give you, but you had a set of ethnicities, which probably you want to list as race and ethnicity, given what they are.
Right.
Um,
So you're talking about below this? and
yeah,
this.
so why would you let me just write in any political party rather than give Democrat, Republican, Independent, other, please identify?
So we were actually gonna change that eventually. But one of the reasons that we initially did that was because not everybody associates themselves with Democrat, Republican, or Independent. Some people just refer to themselves as liberal, some of them conservative, some of them Green Party and things like that. And we were planning on actually switching that over to a selection basis, so Democrat, Republican, and then other with a specification line after, or a variety of those choices. One of the things that we decided to not change and let them, write it out was actually, I believe, religious affiliation, because there are a lot of religions out there, and there are a lot of people that are, vast demographics in the University of Maryland. So one of the things is we didn't really want to limit, because some people associate themselves with Christianity beliefs, but not with the Christianity religion. So we didn't want to limit it so that they could only check Christianity and then have to write something, like, have to explain to us what they meant by that.
And either way is fine. I think you
Mhm.
just need to discuss why you're choosing one over the other, and the coding and the amount of variance you'll get by letting someone self-identify versus if you give them specific options will be much different. And
Right.
then you'll have spelling errors, so someone might spell Spanish wrong, and now you have multiple for the same item. So just keep that in mind when you're assessing the information. And again, I think how you're using it will determine how you collect it. If it's just for screening your participants, that's different than if you want to use it for a statistical analysis.
All right. Any other follow-ups? No? You guys have any questions for us?
Why do you all look so good?
We work at it. It doesn't come easily for some of us. No questions for us? No? All right. Well, thank you very much.
Good job.
Good job.